Good morning and thanks for joining us for our pre-budget webcast. My name's Peter Riley. I'm the tax policy leader here at PwC Ireland and I'm the moderator for today's discussion. As we approach Budget 26, the government finds itself at a critical juncture as we face significant economic uncertainty. In our own pre-budget submission, we called for a reset in key tax policies to safeguard Ireland's competitiveness in four distinct areas, being private business, listed multinationals and FDI, financial services and infrastructure. To break down the choices facing the government between now and Budget Day, I'm going to be joined today by two distinct panels. Our first panel, we're going to get into the economic and geopolitical backdrop to this budget, and we will also get into what the government could and indeed should do on Budget Day. Our second panel will take a deeper dive look at the infrastructure package to which the government has committed and delve into how that is so important for Ireland's economy into the future. So, for my first panel, I'm delighted to be joined by three panellists. Firstly, Mandy Johnston. Mandy has held senior positions at the highest levels of government, politics and business and media in Ireland. Susan Roche, who's a tax partner and leads our foreign direct investment practice. And Mairead Harbron, who's a tax partner in PwC Private and specialises in private client services. Thanks so much for joining us. Mandy, I might come to you first. What are we, 10 months into the government? They're facing their first budget. What room do they really have to manoeuvre politically?
Well, look, I've worked directly on 11 budgets myself and kind of been analysing budgets for nigh on 20 years now. And it's hard for me to remember a time that was so complex from either a geopolitical perspective for Ireland or even domestically that is, is very, very difficult for a government to navigate, notwithstanding the fact that this is their first budget. But maybe let me give you some perspective of what it's like to be inside and how you're trying to frame a budget. So I think we all accept now that the budget itself is largely a piece of theatrics, really. And there are two streams or two themes to this production. One is economic and the second is political. And in that production, you have two very distinct audiences. The first is what I would call a stakeholder audience, which are the people who run the state, the people who are operating from a business perspective within the state, the people who are actually trying to navigate the system. And the second is the public. And in terms of the first theme of a budget, the economic one, we know what the government's parameters are, right? They said themselves in the summer economic statement they're going to have a package of 9.4 billion and established exactly how they are going to spend that between capital current and limited tax. They themselves have put caveats into that based on the tariffs and the geopolitical environment that we're in. And also there's a credibility issue on their spending and on their targets. So I think on the economic front, if they're doing the right thing, it's fairly limited in terms of scope. That's yet to be seen. On the political side, Peter, I think there is far more scope for them to be brave. And I think brave is exactly what this government needs to do at this particular moment in time. The reason they can be brave is often missed, I think. It's because this government has actually got a very large majority in the House. And it's got a majority government which are made up of essentially like-minded people who are pro-business, want to get stuff done. They're not, in any kind of vested interest space. And looking at the programme for government, they are absolutely ambitious to do things. Again, the credibility issue is there. Can they deliver on these? That's yet to be seen. But yes, the government can be brave. And yes, this is the time to do it because the first budget of any administration is largely where you do the heavy lifting. It's where you do the hard things. And I think that's really important for people to remember that this is the time to lean into those difficult decisions, because as the electoral cycle moves on, that becomes harder. If you look at the opposition on the left from the government's perspective, it's very uncoordinated, very unconvincing, and so they're not likely to get a great amount of pushback for things that they can't vote through themselves. And of course, we have to deal with the realpolitik of this situation. You must remember that this budget is going to be delivered just 17 days before a national election, which by all accounts we know should have absolutely no bearing on this, because the office of the president has absolutely no role in the day-to-day running of this country. But that will not stop that campaign impacting, I believe, on a budget. And it is very important that the government take long-term strategic decisions on big ticket items, and not make this a budget about what is essentially a national election campaign. And that for me is the big question. What will they do? Will they set out their stall, or will they be tempted to drive things that actually are populist, predictable, and try to win over the electorate at what is an exceptionally difficult time for Ireland, for our businesses, for the indigenous industries here? I think it's a really important budget.
So there's going to be a bit of a balancing act here, right? But, and now that you say it in terms of the presidential election, we also have a coalition government, which we've had for 30, 40 years in this country, right? But they're each going to be running their own horses in that election, which is probably going to maybe cause some tension as to what you're saying. But what are going to be those kind of trade-offs that we're likely to see between, you know, spending, tax cuts, long-term spending, etc.?
Yeah, you're right. Every budget has its own dynamic and is a balancing act of sorts. But I think the big things that are facing the government, this government at the moment, are, we saw it this week actually, IFAC were out again, warning about fiscal responsibility, warning about corporation tax. And if we didn't have those corporation tax, which the government have now been categorising for 3 years as windfall taxes, to kind of give some sense that this is temporary in nature, that it's not orchestrated or constructed or delivered by governments in the past. And also warning about fiscal responsibility. I guess that's IFAC's job, all right? But that is the mood music from a lot of agencies like that, like the central bank, like the EU, warning about responsible behaviour. And that is sent against a very real and acute understanding now that the state is coming from way behind on major infrastructural things, on water, on energy, on housing, on transport. And I think what will win out there actually is the capital investment side. I think that is going to loom large over this budget. I've been speaking over the last number of days to a lot of political operatives and politicians about what their objectives are. And you're right, actually. What I found is there is no cohesive message to it. They're very much operating in silos. But the one consistent thing, if I could say, that is coming from all of them is infrastructure. So that's one of the trade-offs that I think will win out. On the other trade-off that I think is a big one is the operational costs that are facing SMEs and, you know, indigenous industry. The government themselves have said one of the avenues to guard against and safeguard us against the economic headwinds that we're facing is to shore up indigenous industry. And that's set against rising labour costs, actual labour, and all of those things. So I think the government have to deal with that. And I think they will deal with that. I think the hospitality VAT rate is one example of how they will do that, although I do think whilst it'll be brought in the budget, it probably won't kick in until the middle of next year. But you have that kind of push and pull between operational costs and what maybe the bigger picture is, whether we get R&D credits as requested by yourselves and the likes of IBEC, whether those competitiveness supports for indigenous industry are actually built in. And the final piece of the balancing act for me is on the housing front, which I think is so politically important and so important from a societal point of view, obviously. And there is that awareness in government that it is about the supply side. And I think there's an awareness that the industry has to be brought in, that there has to be significant investments made, and we have to start looking at things like incentives for builders, for investors. But I cannot tell you how paralysed the system is still from the crash in 2008, and they are absolutely terrified of doing anything. That said, I do think there will be measures. We might talk about them later, but they're the type of balancing acts that they have. The problem is, Peter, if you do all of the things you're supposed to do and all the good stuff and all the right things that are long-term thinking, it narrows your scope for politically advantageous things at the ballot box. And therein lies the problem for me. Will they do the right and responsible thing, or will they be tempted to do the popular thing that will get them to an election?
Yeah. Mairead, Mandy touched there on the SME sector, the vital role they play, and she also touched on labour costs, and that's something that we hear about all the time, the increasing cost of labour. What measures could the government actually take in this year's budget to deal with that?
Yeah, so thanks, Peter, and I agree, the SMEs in this country are the backbone of the economy, and as Mandy mentioned, labour costs have just been increasing from everything from auto-enrolment costs, planned increases in employer PRSI, the shortage of labour in certain sectors, and of course the general cost of living increases putting pressure on that. So they are looking for a number of measures in this year's budget. The first would be that there be no more or at least a limit to government mandated increases in labour costs. With some private businesses also calling for, rebates of employer PRSI to ease that pressure. The second kind of area in supporting labour would be more tax-efficient ways to support providing accommodation to employees, and the government could do that by looking at the benefit-in-kind charges on providing employees with affordable housing, right? Particularly in urban areas where supply is scarce. And I suppose, again, on the topic of labour, they're also looking for support with attracting and retaining key talent. And one, I suppose, item that private businesses will be looking out for in this year's budget, or indeed in the finance bill, is the possible introduction of employee ownership trusts, or EOTs as they're known. And in short, that's really a structure that just allows for the tax-efficient passing of ownership from founders to employees. And it's really important in the context we mentioned, FDI and the kind of over-reliance on FDI. So a structure like the EOT would be really important in terms of keeping things in domestic ownership as well.
Yeah, which is fascinating, because I was told recently that I think we create one unicorn a year within the country, but we sell the equivalent in terms of ownership of one unicorn a month to external owners. Susan, just to move internationally for a second, and Mandy has triggered me slightly in terms of this piece around windfall taxes. I don't think it's the best use of phraseology. I don't think it is a windfall, the taxes that we have. What it is, though, is it is concentrated, and it is risky because it's concentrated in a small number of businesses. But when we do look at those large multinational enterprises, be they Irish outbound or indeed FDI, what will they also be looking for in this year's budget? And what can incentivise them to double down on their investments in Ireland?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, Peter, at this stage, it's actually imperative that the government take a real fresh look at tax policies that are in place, really with a view to, as Mandy said, competitiveness and agility. And I think the government have actually acknowledged that we are lagging behind in this. Today, the reports are that there's a report going to the Cabinet in relation to, competitiveness action plan, where there's apparently over 85 recommendations to come out of it across the board in tax policy, legal, regulation, infrastructure. So we wait to see something there, but it's timely. There's the US State Department published an investor consumer sentiment report, and in it they use the words in relation to Ireland: slow, costly, and high tax. They're not three words that we want associated with Ireland as an inward investment hub, and for multinationals from an outbound perspective too. So realistically, what we really need is, and going back to the brave choices that we talked about, some bold decision making here, whereby we see some real policy changes. I think if I had a bit of a wish list, I would start, I think, at the first step with our R&D tax credits. The R&D tax credit regime has been a cornerstone for getting and attracting high-value investment activity into Ireland. But we need to retain that, and we need to move forward with it. We can't stand still. It needs to be enhanced. So at a minimum, we want that rate changed from 30 to 35%, but that's a base level. We need things like the base of that to be broadened as to what actually qualifies. We need a fresh look at the outsourcing limits, because they were put in place at a time where the R&D model was different. Yeah. It's more flexible now, so we need things like that changed. The capital expenditure element of it also needs revamping to make sure we're getting a right return on investment. There are jurisdictions around the world where they do an incremental credit for incremental investment. That's something that we really want to attract here. So something bold and brave around the R&D tax credit would be really interesting. Keeping in mind, like the R&D and the type of industry that we're trying to attract and the investment we're trying to attract, there are certain sectors where we really want to see Ireland be positioned at the forefront. So like the AI, cloud computing. But, we have to accept we have a skills shortage in some of those areas, and there's a cost in terms of hiring for them. The SARP regime is something we'd really like to see some certainty on. So we'd like to see that extended at a very minimum, but also really extended and enhanced so that we can attract in the talent that we need to then attract that wider investment from a longer term perspective. Finally, on my wish list, I think an innovation credit, I have a lot to ask. An innovation credit would be really, really helpful for Ireland. It's something that we're really lacking. When you look at our suite of tax policies, we have nothing to incentivise innovation. When we're trying to leverage, digitalisation, decarbonisation and transformation across the board, to not have an incentive in relation to innovation is really difficult position for Ireland to be in, and really shows us lagging behind. Spain, for example, have a technological innovation credit. Why can't we have something like that? So I think if we don't see things like that coming through, big, bold decisions in the budget and then in the finance bill, I think it'll be a lost opportunity.
I think I'm going to have to give you the same talk that I give my kids coming up to Christmas, right? You're not going to get it all, Susan, I don't think. Just very briefly, if we go back to last year, one of the key things that was introduced by the government was the participation exemption on dividends. We all said hooray. Slightly loaded question, how's that gone?
I'll continue with the hooray. Great that we got it on the books. We were a real outlier not having it. Most other jurisdictions had it, and it's something that stakeholders had been calling for a number of years. So, tick in the box, we got it on the legislation. I think what we've seen practically with clients is that, it's been difficult. There's a lot of uncertainty in the legislation. There's a lot of complexity, and that just means it's difficult to access. We saw the tax strategy papers during the summer make reference to this, so we would be hopeful that there's some tweaks coming to it that make it actually more accessible and give certainty. And I think that's a minimum of what we need for a participation exemption for companies. We need certainty and less complexity. So hopefully some changes to come on that to make it more accessible. I think keeping on that trend of complexity, there are a number of areas where we'd like to see some simplification for companies. And that's really if you think about it, there is nothing that complexity really brings in terms of value add. There's a stat out there from the European Commission, like back in 2019, that companies are spending 1% of their turnover on compliance. That's not value add cost. And that was 2019, before we had the likes of ATAD, before we had the likes of Pillar 2. So that's just going to have incrementally increased. But there's things we can do to fight against that. For example, the financial services sector have been crying out for a number of years for the simplification of our interest deductibility rules. And that's something that, if happened, could actually unlock global investment. So simplification and, taking complexity out of existing rules that we have could actually unlock investment. So something that we really hope to see, being actioned in the finance bill and being flagged in the budget, that there's a real drive towards cutting out the red tape.
Yeah, it can be a real differentiator, is what we're hearing from clients. Mairead, to flick to personal tax measures, I think it's something that our viewers are always quite interested in coming up to budget day, as to what position that'll leave them in.
Yeah, so I guess, rising cost pressures across a number of essential areas like food, energy, housing has all put considerable pressure on households across Ireland. So it will certainly feature in this year's budget, right? However, I think probably the scale of it may be lesser than what we've seen in more recent years. So some typical measures that we'd expect would be, changes to the standard rate band, right? So it's currently at 44k. We might see that go up to 46k maybe to give a bit back to people in that regard. In previous years, we've seen changes to the key tax credits, like the employee tax credit, the personal tax credit, the earned income tax credit. We'd expect to see some tweaks on that as well, to keep lower earners out of that higher income tax rate. And we may also see credits around the home carers credit and the incapacitated childcare credit, again, to kind of help those particular areas of concern. There's been a lot of speculation also on the personal side around inheritance tax. So last year we saw the parent-child threshold go up to 400k. It's not anticipated that there'll be a further increase in that, but there is calls for, you know, in particular from people who don't have children or who may not want to give to their children, to be allowed the use of that band in other areas as well. So whether we see that in this year's budget or not is one to wait for.
Yeah, which would clearly make a lot of sense. But Mandy, politically, you know, this is the first budget, right? So we're not hopefully going to see that whole giveaway piece, and we might invest longer term. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can live in hope on that one, Peter. But I just want to pick up on something that Susan said about the State Department and their characterisation of Ireland. That will be a dagger to the heart of people working in government, because FDI is so important to us and they will not want to be portrayed as that way. But if we think of the experience of large multinationals, of companies trying to come in here and operate, their experience has been very difficult over recent years. And talking about simplification of processes and deregulation, I mean, that's an important part of what the government need to get right. So we have to be cognizant. And I think what they're finding is it's very difficult to unpick the system. As many of us know, it's very difficult to get legislation up and running or regulations introduced. And the same is true of the reverse. So the government are finding that process very difficult. Now, on short-term versus long-term, how difficult is that for the government? Well, it should be very easy for the government actually to set out why it's important to make long-term decisions now, notwithstanding the geopolitical situation that we're living in just this week. All of the developments that we see on the international front, in the EU, in Russia, in Poland, take your pick. It is ripe for the government to constantly explain to the electorate that we need to safeguard ourselves for the future. Doesn't mean a conservative budget, it just means doing things in the right way. But the problem for that is, Peter, that those reforms that are necessary, the long-term ones on housing, on water, on energy, they're very hard to sell politically. And then we get to a situation where something like the presidential campaign does become influential and important. We also have what I call the capacity versus cash versus credibility. So the government might want to do some things. They might even announce doing those things. But the bottlenecks to do those initiatives still exist. And so they have to deal with that. And finally, there is that political tension that I spoke of earlier with ministers in particular. They want signature achievements that they can point to and brand, particularly in an election cycle. So the social welfare changes, the tax credits, they're all good stuff. The problem is they're short term. And I think unless they get that balance right, there is a real credibility risk for this coalition with that first group of people I spoke about, the stakeholders, the people who are the agencies of the state and the big business trying to operate within it. Now, the good news is, I mentioned I did speak to all of the coalition partners over the course of the last couple of days, and the area of commonality, and I know you're going to have a wider discussion on this later, is infrastructure. So that is absolutely where their hearts and minds are at in terms of investment on the capital side. We've seen it with the National Development Plan. We'll probably see it more with the housing plan that's going to come out a couple of days after the budget. But I do think they're heavily invested in that space. Other areas where I think if the government were to be successful, what would success look like? On the housing front, they really need to show things that are deliverable within the lifetime of this government. And I think you will see a package of measures within the budget package, which could see things moving, like cruel, moving to more like social and affordable housing, like VAT reductions on apartments, like reductions in corporation tax on the Land Development Agency, initiatives like that which could point to tangible differences within the lifetime of the government. I think on social welfare, yes, the budget package is much more limited now than it was. The government have said they are not going to do the once-off packages that they've done in the past. They can't afford to. And could I just point out that those temporary measures that the government have introduced over the last 3 years have accounted for 16.5 billion, which is enough, and then some to build the metro. They cannot continue to do that. So they're going to have to target those social welfare measures in a very defined way. I think the spending growth targets are fairly conservative, to be honest with you, when you strip out all the commitments that they've made and crucially the overspending that they have to build into next year. The key question for me remains the same. Can they take that responsible first budget outlook, do the heavy lifting and the hard work now, while they're overshadowed by a presidential election which is highly political and could have consequences for the leaderships of at least two parties?
Okay. Susan, if we move back internationally just for a second, right, and we kind of ignore this year's budget, but there's a lot of stuff going on internationally that clients probably need to be aware of. Can you just give me a quick overview of a couple of those?
We've been on a bit of a roller coaster and probably not finished on that roller coaster, Peter, I would say. So a couple of things between now and year end and looking out forward to Q1 next year. Pillar 2 changes. We're going to see some, work on the OECD side-by-side agreement, work on the, treatment of the refundable credits, and work on the simplified permanent safe harbours. A lot of noise, but hopefully maybe some certainty that we'll see at the end of that. Outside of that, we're also seeing the OECD do some work on remote working in the Model Convention, as a result of COVID actions. And we're also seeing the UN in terms of the international model, in terms of their work. Now, we know the US aren't involved in it, but it provides a flag in the hill for what other jurisdictions might pick up from that. From a good news perspective, we're expecting to see the EU come out with the ATAD and DAC review, and both of those reviews will hopefully give some good news in terms of cutting down red tape. So looking forward to seeing some of that, Peter.
Great. Mairead, really quickly on VAT, we've discussed it a little bit.
Yeah,
a lot in the news.
Very quickly, I suppose there's a lot of speculation around the VAT rate, the 9% rate. It was there last year. There was a lot of pressure for the hospitality sector in light of high-profile restaurant closures and losses of jobs in the industry. There is an expectation that there will be something in that space, but targeted to kind of cafes and restaurants, definitely not for hotels and a hotel accommodation.
Okay.
And I think on that one, whilst it will be introduced in the budget, it may be delayed in terms of implementation until the middle of next year.
Okay. Just to wrap up, Mandy, one of the things that seems to be coming through is, we need an innovation credit, we need to be bold on VAT, we need to do big things for the longer term. We also need to attract investment, right? That seems that we need to make, we need to be agile, we need to make bold decisions. We used to do that. What's blocking us doing that again?
I don't think it's necessarily unique to Ireland. I think politics has become much more instant, much more short term, and that long-term strategic thinking, even 5 budgets now seems like a long time for a government, to stay in place. And I remember when we were in government, we would look at a 5-year cycle like a book, and we'd start off with what is our book? How are we going to end? What's the narrative? And the first chapter is where you explain to people, here's the pathway, here's the statement of intent for us. I think also politicians have become less powerful in the Irish system. And I think it's harder for them to get the system to move. That could be a combination of things. But I think that's where we're at. And I think the political body is understanding, actually, that in order to effect the changes that it genuinely is ambitious to do, I believe, it has to have a serious word with itself. And that's why you see things like Jack Chambers and what he's doing with Sean O'Driscoll and the changes that they're trying to make in Deeper. They're important parts of making the system move. And I think a combination of all those things is just making it much harder. We used to be able to do those big things. And, the face of this country has changed over the last 30 years with infrastructural development, road networks. We are able to do it. We just have to get back to that.
Super. Listen, Mandy, thanks so much to yourself, Mairead and Susan for your insights. The government clearly has an awful lot to think about between now and budget day. In a moment, we're going to move to our second panel for the day, where we'll turn our attention to one of the most critical levers and something that we've already discussed a little bit in terms of the government's economic strategy, and that's infrastructure.
To be globally competitive, your domestic infrastructure must be high quality, well delivered, predictable. You don't want uncertainty.
And we're very clearly, proudly, loudly saying we're going to invest it in infrastructure, in pinch points right across the country. And I think that gives every minister now, every department, every state agency certainty to get out of the door.
But we've got to provide for that in terms of our water infrastructure, in terms of housing, in terms of energy infrastructure, public transport and roads. And we're going to do that.
In our recent submission to the Accelerating Infrastructure Task Force, we called for a radical shift in how we approach infrastructure. We recommended a long-term 30 to 50-year national infrastructure plan linked to a prioritised national development plan, which would crucially be supported by multi-funding to take it away from political cycles. We also highlighted the need to tackle risk aversion, to reform procurement practices and to create a permanent forum for private infrastructure investors. To help me dig into that submission and a little more, I'm joined by two authors of our submission. So Sinead Liu, who's a tax partner with a particular focus on real estate and capital projects in infrastructure, and Rob Costello, corporate finance partner and head of PwC Ireland's Capital Projects and Infrastructure Group. Thanks, guys, and Rob, I nearly made you tax partner there. Rob, can we start with baby steps, right? Why is cracking infrastructure delivery so urgent, and how does that link to Budget 2026?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for the compliment on the tax partner. I guess I'll focus on three areas, really. Infrastructure, the first one really is about the quality of life and social cohesion. Infrastructure is around us every day. It's how we travel to work, how kids travel to school. It's use of our electricity and power in our homes and access to clean water. And it's also reliability on social infrastructure in the form of schools and third level education, but also hospitals. But most importantly, it's a roof over our head that we can actually afford. So it's critical to our quality of life. The second point then is on our binding or legally binding climate action targets, and then a moral responsibility. So we have targets in place, which is absolutely the right thing to do in terms of climate action for 2030. It's about reducing our emissions by 51% to 2030, and then getting to net zero by 2050. And that's critical in terms of the environment and the need from that perspective. Then competitiveness and prosperity. The Draghi report, which I think was referenced previously as well, was released in September of last year, and it looks across Europe in terms of how competitive we are globally. But it looked at Ireland in particular, and it identified significant infrastructure deficits, and those deficits are essentially a drag on our economy. So there's an urgent need to address those. And then more recently, the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council talked about the fact that we are 25% behind in terms of development of our infrastructure compared to other developed countries across Europe. So it's critical, and from a Budget 26 perspective, it's really important that starts to get addressed and people kind of grasp the nettle of the infrastructure deficit and challenge.
It's going to cost a lot, Sinead, right? And I would assume that not all of that is going to be able to be funded from public coffers, right? So we need private investment. What tax measures could be introduced to try and help private investment into the area?
I think there's a number of different measures that can be introduced. And I suppose what's key is that it's the fact that tax policy absolutely has a role to play here. It's one of a suite of measures. But, Ireland has a long and pretty successful history of leveraging tax policy to help us achieve strategic aims, drive economic growth. So I think it really stands to reason when we have a clear need that, as Rob has articulated there, that we would again look to tax policy to help us to mobilise and influence the necessary investment that we need to meet our infrastructure needs, but also critically to capitalise on what is a massive economic opportunity for us that goes alongside that. And we do need to make sure we don't lose sight of that as well as a country. I suppose tax can go generally one of two ways. You can go carrot or you can go stick. I think in terms of measures, what we'd expect to see and what's typically favoured when you're trying to drive private investment is carrot. And I think a pretty relatively recent example of this on an international scale is the US Inflation Reduction Act that we saw come in under the previous US administration. Massive suite of measures, huge number of tax policy measures focused around driving investment both domestically and internationally into its energy transition and decarbonisation efforts. And some of the numbers coming out from that were staggering in terms of the job growth it created. I think the Rhodium Group estimated it led to 493 billion of investment in a 2-year period between mid-22 and 24, up 71%. And what it did particularly well in relation to tax incentives was that, it created or introduced credits that were well designed and clever in terms of there was kind of baseline credits, but then if you located in certain low income jurisdictions or low employment communities, they quite quickly ratcheted up and were extremely valuable and attractive to investors. And in some instances, you could even sell them for cash. It was bold, it was innovative. To pick up a theme from the previous panel, it was probably brave. And I think it is that kind of thinking that we need around investment. I suppose when tax policy will always say we do want these things to be cost efficient, targeted, but absolutely, you know, give that certainty and that investors need to be attracted into the industry.
100%. I completely agree with you. Rob, the National Development Plan is ambitious, right? It's certainly ambitious, and that's great. But project delivery is hard, right? I think you told me that the average large-scale infrastructure project in Ireland has moved from a lifespan a number of years ago of about 7 years to 14 or 15 years.
15 years, yeah.
What's going on?
It's a big issue. I guess if I was to take it back, it used to be, or certainly over the last probably 15 years or from 2010 to 20 anyway, funding was the issue. So we didn't have enough money to spend on infrastructure and capital projects. More recently, funding's less of an issue. We've had budget surpluses and we've had significant accumulation of funds to help fund capital projects. And more recently then, the government announced a National Development Plan, which you referred to just before the summer recess, which talks about an investment of 275 billion over the course of the next 10 years across the various sectors of government involved in infrastructure. There'll also be a need for private investment as part of that, and I think we'll talk about that shortly. But the biggest barrier still is planning. Of that cycle that you referred to, the majority of that time to get infrastructure delivered is because it's stuck in the planning system. We are trying to implement reforms as a country. The government have the plan in place to update the Planning and Development Act, and that's going to address things like mandatory timelines, streamline judicial reviews, and resourcing to the regulator in particular, and that's happening at the moment. But the issues are still there, and it's going to take time to address. And a good example of that is the Greater Dublin Drainage Project, which got planning back in July. That's a critical project for wastewater in Dublin as the population grows, but even just the existing infrastructure. And that has gone to judicial review as recently as last week. So that's going to delay that project by a number of months, if not years, as well, which has a knock-on effect then to
And indeed, I think Michael McDougall has an article in today's Irish Times which says, isn't it great, we'll have a national drainage system in Dublin in about 25 years. I mean, this is disappointing stuff, right?
It is. The other point I wanted to talk about briefly, and again, it's in our submission. I think Mandy talked about it at length in the previous panel as well, so I won't dwell on it too much, but it's the risk aversion piece, and it's a big issue. Politicians are finding it difficult to get the system to move on some of these objectives, and that needs to be addressed. And we see it across a number of areas. Central government has challenges in that space, and a lot of it's related to the fact that we implemented fairly significant austerity measures over 10 to 15 years, and that kind of mentality still exists, and that culture still exists. So unlocking that and breaking that is going to be a big thing. And then obviously the right governance in place, not over governance, but the right level of governance, so that these projects can get moving, and particularly the strategic ones, which are really important. And then finally on that point is really just about building up the capability. We have lost significant capability in certain areas of delivery agencies, of other things, and that's happening, but funding also needs to come for that capability.
Okay. You touched on climate targets, right, at the start of this, and obviously they're critical. How will the infrastructure plan play into that? Are we going to meet those targets? Are we being ambitious enough?
Yeah, so I guess the 51% that I talked about for 2030, I think we're unlikely to reach that target. We're doing well in certain sectors, probably falling behind in others, but we are on the right track. So if we don't reach it in 2030, we may get there in 2035. Not predicting that as a number, but certainly we are on the right track. 2050 is a good bit further out, but you still need a fairly significant investment for that to get to net zero. So I guess from a investment perspective, I think I've mentioned the fact that we've got the 275 billion, but there's also a really critical role that private investment can play, particularly in decarbonisation, particularly in areas like energy. And we do have private investment in renewables, but we can expand that with the right regulatory frameworks to attract more investment in areas like EV charging, for example, or biomethane. We can also overlap then into transport potentially, which has also been traditionally publicly funded. But with some of these large-scale projects coming on board, there's opportunities there to expand that. But all of these areas will be critical then in terms of the Climate Action Plan and delivering on our climate targets.
And maybe just to come in there in terms of the role of tax and bringing it back kind of more domestically, building on kind of what I was touching on before, I think Budget 2026 is coming. The backdrop to that is quite interesting, and in the context of kind of energy, our energy transition and decarbonisation, it's the Draghi report was mentioned earlier. That then led to the Clean Industrial Deal being introduced at an EU level in February of this year. And that is really focused on driving investment into clean technologies and decarbonisation. And what we've seen, probably I think for maybe the first time, was it specifically came out then in July with recommendations around tax incentives that member states should introduce. And they're focused around credits to drive investments that are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, areas like focusing on accelerated depreciation to really drive the acquisition and lease of clean technology equipment. So then if we kind of, how does that translate to Budget 2026? And it's something that we looked at in terms of our own pre-budget submission. And things that we'd like to see there is we have an accelerated capital allowances regime. It's due to expire at the end of this year, and there's great uncertainty around that. So at a minimum, we'd recommend that that's extended, but really we want to see that expanded, amended so that there's a huge greater number of products that will qualify. I think that would send a really important signal. It would really encourage businesses to invest in more decarbonisation projects. Susan touched upon it earlier around the R&D credit, potential innovation credit. That's going to be critically important to drive investment in areas like climate tech. Well, we have, again, a massive opportunity to be a leader in this and create a whole new industry for ourselves in this. And also what's going to be ultimately really critical, we kind of have the funding, we have some challenges around planning. The next that's going to come, and it's even been felt a bit at the minute, is the supply chain. So it's great if we have all the money, but do we have the people that are actually going to be able to develop these things? In Ireland, we actually have a number of successful companies that are, have been created here, but they're servicing the supply chain elsewhere. And that's down to, look, they're further along in their decarbonisation journey. They have that surety around pipeline of projects. We need to attract these people home, and then some. We need to attract other companies, and that's going to come down to increased corporation tax deductions to support setting up and operating here, upskilling, retraining people, and also that simplification point or ease of doing business. We need to streamline processes around, VAT claims that could be quite significant on energy transition projects, RCT, enabling people to get access to the 0% rate quicker and refunds quicker. And actually, if I just summarise what that is, it essentially comes down to controlling our own controllables. This is all within our own remit to do. We're not dependent on anything going on anywhere else. And I think that's a key theme that we need to focus on domestically.
I think this is why we jump up and down a little bit, because a lot of what you've said does not have a P&L impact for Ireland Inc., right? Exactly. These are things, as you say, that we can control, that we can make a difference on without actually having to dip into the public coffers. Yeah. And so they're the types of things that I think we should be trying to action immediately, because while they won't have a negative P&L impact today, which is great, they will have a positive P&L impact absolutely into the future. Rob, you've talked a little bit about the infrastructure plan, the need for one, but what does a credible infrastructure plan really look like?
So on the last panel, Mandy talked about her time in government and the 5-chapter book approach to government. What I would like to see is a 40-chapter book approach to capital investment in government. And what I mean by that is a long-term infrastructure plan for the country, acknowledging things like demographic growth, economic prosperity, and so population growth, demographic change, and economic prosperity, so that we're really kind of planning out this long-term. Ideally, that would get cross-government support, and that can happen, and that will help with things like multi-annual funding, so commitments beyond the 5-year cycle. smoothing out capital expenditure curves, so no boom and bust cycles. And an example of this, and we put in a submission to the Infrastructure Task Force on it, but we did do a trawl of what's global best practice in this space. And in New South Wales and in Australia, they launched in 2018 a 40-year transport strategy for the state. And that strategy, transport focus, not fully infrastructure, but that has resulted to date in a new metro line being built and 3 about to come on board as well. It's also increased bus capacity and light rail across the city of Sydney and beyond that into some of the other cities. But as well as that, it has unlocked the provision of, or the need for a new airport, and then even the provision of new towns and housing to be built in certain areas where those stations will go to. So it's a real forward-looking plan. It also looks obviously at utilities that need to support all of that around renewable electricity and water infrastructure as well. And then the social side of things around cultural areas and hospitals and schools. So a lot of things fall out of those kind of long-term plans. They need cross-party support, but they can go beyond the political cycle, and we think that Ireland needs that.
It just makes so much sense. I mean, if the metro, which is now being approved to be built, if when that was shelved maybe 14, 15 years ago, had gone ahead, it would have been a counter-cyclical item, which would have employed a lot of people, and we'd now have the metro.
We'd be travelling on it right now, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Sinead, briefly on housing, right? We hear so much about the chronic undersupply, okay? What tax measures can be brought in to try to stimulate the housing market?
Mandy touched on it earlier. I think what we need and what we can expect to see on the 7th of October is, a huge number of supply-focused measures. Because I think if we can unlock the supply, the affordability starts to eventually take care of itself. So we're going to expect to see, and I think what the industry is calling to see, is some changes to things like the residential zoned land tax. That has proved, it was introduced in Finance Act 2021 as a land activation measure and was welcomed. But what we've seen, I suppose, in navigating through that new legislation over the last number of years, it actually only went live this year with first returns and payments being made, is that there are a number of, quite significant practical challenges around how that legislation actually works in practice. It doesn't really cater. There are deferrals, there are abatements where you're actively developing the land, but it doesn't take account of the fact that you may be caught up in planning, you may be subject to judicial reviews, and it's giving rise to, quite significant tax exposures for people who are genuinely trying to, do what the tax aim to do, but they are actually developing the land. So we would really call for urgent changes to residential zoned land tax. Again, it was touched on earlier, the introduction of a temporary reduction in the VAT rate applying to the supply of immovable goods in the context of, trying to support new apartments and houses for first-time buyers. We have a stamp duty residential rebate scheme. Again, there's a number of amendments that are needed there for it to be, fit for purpose. It's another measure also due to expire. We'd ask for it to be extended. And then lastly, I think, what remains critically important for the Irish property sector and is going to unlock supply is that we need to continue to attract investment in. And that's going to come down to making sure the likes of our REIT regime is fit for purpose. So we would call for some amendments there. And lastly, then our IREF regime, it's gone through significant tax and regulatory changes in previous years. I think the ask there is, at a very minimum, we need to build back up confidence in that structure. So to the extent that there's changes, these need to be well signposted and consulted on.
Yeah, super, which is a common theme. I think, finally, Rob, we do now have a dedicated infrastructure fund, right, for long-term capital projects. What will that mean about how we can act differently in the future in different crises, as I'm sure we'll get to?
Yeah, and I talked about the boom and bust cycles, and I guess what you're referring to there, Peter, is the announcement last year from Minister McGrath at the time around the Future Ireland Fund, and that's essentially a fund that will build up over time, and there's commitments for government to allocate funding to that over the next number of years, and expect that will continue into the longer term. It's uncapped in terms of how big it can get, but there is a target to get it to 100 billion by 2035. And hopefully what that means is it gives us a buffer in periods of recession where, the best bang for your buck from a government perspective in investment in infrastructure is actually in a recessionary period. Because private sector investment might have gone out of the country. There might be issues around construction in other areas, like real estate, for example, we would have seen in the past. And government can come in and provide that buffer in terms of keeping that sector going and building much needed infrastructure anyway. So having that fund in place will give us the buffer, hopefully, that we need. The critical piece will be the governance of all of that and making sure that nobody raids those coffers. If the Troika come or anybody else come knocking, if we're hopefully fingers and toes crossed, we're never in that situation. But it is a very positive move. The other point I'd say on it is that it's still critically important that we invest in infrastructure now, because we have a gap that we have to address. And I know IFAC, as of this week, are warning around the budget and some of the budget measures and risks of overheating the economy. I do think there's a lot of realism has to be applied to that too, in the context of infrastructure and capital spend, and I do think that the government are saying that, to be fair, that this focus of this budget is very much on infrastructure and really trying to go at that deficit. So it's important that message is consistent, and the spending measures are more about efficiencies, obviously efficiencies in capital spend, but efficiencies across the operational expenditure side of things, which could do with some addressing.
Super. Well, listen, thanks so much to you, Rob, and thanks, Sinead. With that, we've reached the end of this year's pre-budget webcast. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their input and insights, and to you, the audience, for joining. Our budget webcast will be hosted on the 7th of October, wherein we'll share our insights very shortly after the ministers finish their speeches in the Dáil. We'll also host a series of in-person events around the country on the morning following Budget Day. I hope that you can join us then, either virtually or in person, to discuss the Minister's budget and what it means for businesses and households. In the meantime, you can view our full suite of budget analysis on pwc.ie/budget. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you again soon.